As the Supreme Court prepares to hear a challenge to President Trump's emergency tariffs, what do the law and the history say about how the justices are likely to come down? And what about the White House's warnings that if it loses, the result will be financial ruin?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues on the editorial page, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. It's election day in America, or at least those parts of the country that have odd year races on the ballot, notably New York City, New Jersey, and Virginia. But as we wait for the verdict of the voters to discuss tomorrow, let's take up the very significant argument that will be at the Supreme Court on Wednesday, a pair of cases challenging President Trump's tariffs under a law called IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. Let's start with President Trump on Air Force One on Sunday, laying out the stakes of this case from his point of view.
I think it's the most important decision, one of the most important decisions in the history of our country. Because without tariffs, without our being able to use tariffs freely, openly, and in every way, we would suffer tremendously from a national security standpoint. The national security of our country is at stake. It's I think it's one of the biggest decisions in the history of the Supreme Court. Other countries use tariffs against us. If we weren't able to openly and freely use tariffs against them, I'll give you an example, China. That was going to be a disaster for the world, and I was able to settle it very quickly, very easily, because I was able to use tariffs. It's total national security. And economic health is also part of national security, by the way. But without tariffs, our country would be in great jeopardy.
So will you attend the oral arguments?
No, I don't think so, because I don't want to call a lot of attention to me. It's not about me, it's about our country.
Alicia, the Journal's editorial today takes a somewhat different view under the headline, The Tariff King and the Supreme Court. What is the argument being made there?
Well, I would agree with President Trump that this is maybe one of the most important cases, at least of this last 20 years in terms of constitutional importance. Now, the argument here is, or the question before the court is whether he has this authority under this 1977 law known as IEEPA to impose tariffs willy-nilly. The law gives the president pretty broad authority when there's a national emergency and he has to declare it, to quote-unquote deal with any unusual and extraordinary threat, including to quote-unquote regulate the importation of foreign property. Now, the way the Trump administration, Mr. Trump, parses those terms is that this allows him to impose tariffs because he is, quote unquote, regulating imports that way. But the problem here is that tariffs are also taxes, and the Constitution vests Congress with the power to both regulate, by the way, foreign commerce and to impose taxes. And Congress has not expressly delegated this authority to President Trump in this law, though it has in other laws given the president authority to impose tariffs, for instance, including, by the way, to protect national security. That's Section 232. And some other tariff authorities, like if a country is discriminating against the U.S., that was actually the basis for many of President Trump's first-term tariffs against China. So it's simply not true that striking down these tariffs would remove the president's authority to deal with some of these issues that he's raising.
To underline the point there about the text of IEEPA, this 1977 law, it includes a long list of things that the president may do regarding foreign property, including regulate, direct and compel, nullify, void, prevent or prohibit any acquisition, holding, withholding, use, transfer, transportation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, Kim, a couple points here. One is that the word tariff and the word tax are not among those many verbs that is used by IEEPA. This is a big part of the argument is what does regulate mean? So here is a piece of the brief filed by the White House Solicitor General John Sauer. He argues the power to regulate importation plainly encompasses the power to impose tariffs. Regulate is a broad term that encompasses monetary exactions. When paired with importation, the resulting phrase unambiguously encompasses tariffs. And the challengers have a couple points here. One is that, as Alicia lays out, they're saying that this tariff power is actually taxing power. And they're also pointing to other places in the statute books where agencies are authorized to regulate. So here's one of them from a brief of one of the challengers. If regulate encompasses the taxation power, wherever commonplace, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau may impose a 50% tax on credit card companies under its authority to regulate the offering and provision of consumer financial products or services. So, Kim, help make sense of this. I take the point that regulate is a pretty broad word, but it is also a broad word that is used all over the federal statute books.
Yeah. There's a couple of big problems for the Trump team. Alicia laid out one of the big ones, which is simply a constitutional argument that this is taxation without representation. The Constitution gives the power of the purse to the Congress. And that's a pretty big deal. And so, look, Congress bears a little bit of responsibility here and made this situation muddy by ceding some of its authority over the years. But still, there is this broad argument. Then you get to, as you note, the statutory arguments. And one problem they have is that IEEPA does not spell this out. It does not say you are allowed to do this. And if you look at a lot of other, forget other regulatory agencies or other statutes governing different types of powers that spell out when you can tax and when you can't tax. If you just look at trade law as well, too, IEEPA does not spell out the power to tax, but there are other sections of trade laws that very clearly do. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 allows tariffs on imports that threaten national security. There are other provisions in the 1974 Trade Act that allow tariffs in response to balance of payments deficits or discriminatory trade practices. You don't have that here in IEEPA. Again, too, here's the other problem the Trump team has, is that no other president has used it this way. And the court actually does care about that historical precedent. The court has said in the past that is a telling indication of whether or not a use of executive power is legal. And while you've had prior presidents who've used IEEPA to freeze assets or restrict U.S. companies from doing business or limit the export of certain technologies or ban some imports from our adversaries, there hasn't been a president prior to Trump that actually used the law for tariffs. So that's what they're wandering into legally. The one more thing I would just throw in as well, too, is this new doctrine that the court has been refining in recent years, a major questions doctrine that essentially says you need express authorization from Congress for actions that are really significant. And I think, as you can listen to Donald Trump right there saying, he would argue that, yes, his tariffs are pretty significant. And to not have Congress specifically have said in writing clearly that this is a power that he has, I think is going to weigh against him in these court arguments.
One final thought from me on this word regulate, also a word that is used in the statute that the Biden administration went to the Supreme Court saying would allow the Surgeon General and the CDC to impose a national eviction moratorium during COVID. That law said that the Surgeon General is authorized to make and enforce such regulations as in his judgment are necessary to prevent the introduction, transmission, or spread of communicable diseases. And the Supreme Court ultimately said that did not extend to a nationwide eviction moratorium, in part because the law then goes on to talk about fumigation and pest elimination and things like that. And so they even apart from the major questions doctrine, they read words in their context. So again, when the IEEPA says regulate, nullify, void, prevent, I mean, I think that points back to the history of how IEEPA has been used, Alicia, which is mainly as a sanctions law. So if you go back and look at the Congressional Research Service, for example, has a list of previous invocations of IEEPA. Here are a handful of them. 1994, measures to restrict the participation by United States persons in weapons proliferation activities. 2001, prohibiting the importation of rough diamonds from Sierra Leone. 2003, blocking property of persons undermining democratic processes or institutions in Zimbabwe. 2008, continuing certain restrictions with respect to North Korea and North Korean nationals. And so, Alicia, it just seems like, to use a phrase from Justice Scalia, the Trump administration is trying to hide an elephant in the mouse hole of the law here. The law gives him pretty broad authority for national security purposes and emergencies to block transactions, to go after certain individuals, government property of foreign adversaries, but it is not a trade law, and he's trying to use it as a trade law.
I think that's exactly right. The administration kind of introduced a new argument late in the game. It filed a response brief to the challengers late Thursday, making this kind of novel argument that, well, there is a precedent for this because James K. Polk, back during the Mexican-American War, almost 200 years ago, imposed tariffs on Mexico. And those were upheld. And he also, by the way, the Union and I believe it was Lincoln also imposed tariffs on the Confederacy. And so during wartime, presidents have imposed tariffs. And the Congress, when it wrote the 1917 Trading with the Enemy Act, which was the progenitor for the IEEPA, legislated against that background. And so therefore, the president has the authority under IEEPA to impose tariffs. Never mind that we're not engaging in any war. This is a very strained logic. But it just underlines how much the administration is really grasping at straws here. The court has been very reluctant to strike down president's use of or executive powers in the foreign policy context and national security. And you saw that in the travel ban case that came up during the President Trump's first term, where it upheld his President Trump's basically decision or that visas cannot be granted to certain countries, denying entry of immigrants for national security reasons. And that was challenged by a bunch of states, and the court said we're not going to try to essentially micromanage foreign policy or national security decisions. We provide great deference in that realm. But this really isn't a foreign tariffs is really isn't a foreign policy issue. It's trade, which belongs fundamentally under the Constitution to Congress. And now Congress, if it wants, could potentially delegate some additional authority to President Trump. I think that would be ill-advised at this moment. But then it would still, I think, under this non-delegation doctrine, which the Supreme Court has kind of danced around in recent years, would still have to provide some kind of intelligent principle. And that would, if you look at that, you might look at the Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act, which allowed the president to impose tariffs of up to 15% for 150 days. But after that, they must be approved by Congress. So at least there is some kind of limit to the president's authority in the law. The Congress can't just hand the president freewheeling authority to impose taxes.
On the point about this being foreign policy, I mean, there are foreign policy implications, and President Trump is using this IEEPA leverage and the threat of tariffs to get trade deals. But at a fundamental level, what is being taxed is still importers in the United States and the eventual consumers of whether they're final products or inputs of companies. If they're consuming raw materials that are produced overseas, those taxes are being borne by Americans. Kim, the other thing that these conservative justices, at least on the Supreme Court, are often looking for in cases like this is a limiting principle. And that is another problem, I think, for the Trump administration, because I have a hard time seeing where the limiting principle is if, as the John Sauer argues, regulate can mean tariff on anyone at any time, at any level, whenever the president wants, on a whim. And you can imagine how that could be used by future Democratic presidents declaring a climate emergency, saying we are going to tariff countries based on their carbon output, or we're going to tariff products based on our evaluation of their carbon output. And there's no check on this from Congress, no check from anyone. This is just a power that the president now has. Or another one, I mean, you can imagine a president declaring inequality an emergency and putting a tax on luxury goods, or putting a tax on different countries based on how their Gini coefficient looks. It is really hard for me to figure out, if the president is victorious here, how there's any kind of limit or check on the tariff authority that John Sauer argues has been given by Congress to the White House.
And one of the problems, I think, for the Trump administration will be exactly that, because of the breadth of how Trump is using this. This is not an administration that came in and said, in this one particular case, we find this to be, an act of aggression by an adversary, and we need to enact a tariff as a result in one situation. I mean, when Donald Trump does things, he does them bigly, right? And so we've got, Trump this spring slapping tariffs on pretty much every country around the world, arguing that this was justified because of a trade deficit and because of fentanyl and national emergencies. He's now moved those tariff rates up and down, sometimes in either a provocation or as a reward to a foreign government. You get benefited by having you were nice to us, so we're now lowering your tariff rate. And see, for instance, the recent 10% border tax hike on Canada, which apparently was in retaliation for Ontario running a TV ad that actually quoted Ronald Reagan criticizing tariffs. This really stuck in President Trump's craw. And so, boom, Canada now has a higher tariff rate. And that gets to your point about no limiting principle here. One thing I would just add is that on this argument that he made too, that, if you take this power away from me, this is so vital and I can't handle national security issues and foreign relations unless you give this to me. Let me stress here, the power to tariff still exists. It's not like the United States is unilaterally saying we have no ability to engage in tariffs. It's simply that Donald Trump would have to go to Congress and convince Congress of the wisdom and the need to impose some of these tariffs. And he might not like the inconvenience of that. But when it comes to the constitutional question and the statutory question, he still has, there are still powers to tariff. It's just that he doesn't have a freewheeling ability to impose them and revoke them on a whim.
Alicia, what do you make of the argument that the Trump administration is also advancing, that the president needs this power, particularly given that he has already used it to cut deals with these foreign countries? And if the Supreme Court strikes down that power and forces those to be unwound, that there is economic devastation to follow. And just to make sure I'm not taking anybody out of context, this is a piece of a letter that the Solicitor General John Sauer wrote and filed earlier this year in the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. He says, if the United States were forced to unwind these historic agreements, the president believes that a forced dissolution of the agreements could lead to a 1929-style result. In such a scenario, people would be forced from their homes, millions of jobs would be eliminated, hardworking Americans would lose their savings, and even Social Security and Medicare could be threatened. In short, the economic consequences would be ruinous instead of unprecedented success. And Alicia, I wonder what you make of the implications if the Supreme Court strikes down these tariffs. I mean, overall tariff revenue in fiscal 2025 of the United States was something like $200 billion. If a lot of that was taken from people without lawful authority, I would imagine the United States would owe a refund to those folks, which is an issue, a fiscal problem, perhaps. But I don't know if the markets wouldn't breathe a sigh of relief.
Well, right. I think they would. I think that it may actually already be baked in that these tariffs are likely to get struck down. Potentially, the president might turn to some other tariff authorities, but I think there would be a lot more economic certainty because the president presumably wouldn't then be able to just impose tariffs willy-nilly on whatever countries at whatever rates, whenever he wants for whatever reason, which is what's been happening. You point to the revenue effect, and yes, the Trump administration or the government would have to be required to administer refunds to these businesses that have paid the tariffs over the last 6 or 7 months. But these companies would actually have to apply for them. And there's already been some talk that this is just going to be too onerous of a process for a lot of these small businesses, that they might not even bother. So they're actually selling some off their claims to hedge funds. So hedge funds could potentially make some money, because they'll go and deal with the government just kind of like they sometimes do when insurance companies and there are payouts. Now, for the revenue effect for the government, so they may potentially have to pay out $100 billion, maybe $200 billion in refunds. Now, that really is kind of small potatoes when you have a $2 trillion deficit, and which is going higher. But I think the businesses and there would be relieved, and there would be probably some uptick in economic growth just from not having that $3 trillion tax hike over the next decade, which, by the way, is what the administration projected that the tariffs would raise, hanging over them. Tariffs are taxes, and taxes reduce growth. They reduce productivity. They reduce investment. And you've already been seeing that in the economy, by the way, where a lot of small businesses in particular have kind of pulled back. You see it in the business surveys, the Institute for Supply Management's manufacturing survey that came out just yesterday. Businesses were all saying that the tariffs were creating enormous uncertainty, and they were putting on pause a lot of investments because they don't know what's going to happen. And maybe the Supreme Court decision striking that down could provide some kind of clarity and will provide a boost to investment.
Kim, what's your read of this question of the likely economic effects? The other thing that markets may have already priced in is just the probability that if Trump loses this argument on IEEPA, he will be back to the statute books, these other laws that over many years Congress has granted some kind of more limited tariff authority to the president. I mean, I suspect that if he loses this case, we're going to spend the next couple years talking a lot about Section 338, for example, Section 301, Section 232. And it is true that there are some limitations on some of those tariff powers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if this ends up being struck down, that there is going to be some real short-term upheaval and uncertainty. Because if there's one thing we know about Donald Trump is he's not giving up on tariffs. Okay, he's centered a great deal of his second-term legacy around them, and if he gets rebuked by the Supreme Court on this broad authority, he will have a whole team of people that are going to reach to those other authorities, and it's going to scramble all of the deals that have been negotiated so far, and countries are once again going to end up with different rates, and then there'll have to be more negotiations. So uncertainty, it'll be kind of tough on the markets. But let me just point this out. This is the path that Trump chose. Okay, nobody's making him do this. And one thing that I really, really hope is that the Supreme Court does not take that argument on board, because it's one of the worst arguments of all for a court is, well, just because this is going to be really tough to unwind, we should just let the constitutional or statutory offense slide. It's actually been my complaint of prior Supreme Courts. I still remember Barack Obama's really offensive move to appoint some of his nominees to the National Labor Relations Board after he unilaterally declared the Senate in recess. And the Supreme Court later came back and ruled 9-0 that he'd egregiously violated the Constitution, but at the same time lacked the courage. I mean, so it said those appointments were nullified, but it lacked the backbone to nullify the decisions that those illegal board members had made while they were in office on the grounds that it would just cause too much upheaval. And it was a terrible, terrible signal to send to the executive branch, because the message was, well, we'll just do things that are patently illegal, and hopefully some of what we put into place will stay even when we get caught later. And that was Joe Biden's very bloody-minded approach to student loan forgiveness. I'll just forgive it all before the courts have a chance to stop me. And so, I do appreciate that the court is being, by the way, more recently, Obamacare. John Roberts kind of wilted on that issue. And here we are 15 years later, still dealing with the consequences of Obamacare, because the court felt that having wrenched the country into this whole new healthcare system, it would be too big of a wrench to dismantle it. But I think in this one, they're going to have to make a clean sweep of this, because you could end up with this very torturous legal situation and a lot more drama if they don't have a clear view on where this ends.
Thank you, Kim and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.